Today, I want to talk about the Seeress, and also how women, they seem to have a predisposition towards perception. Now, you could say that women, the fairer sex, they have evolved this way compared to us, the male, the more brutish sex. They evolved a sort of social, they're more socially perceptive, I guess you could say. They pick up on social cues much better than we do. And you could say that this was an evolutionary trait that developed thousands of years ago. Women, being physically smaller and weaker in most cases, they had to pick up on these things. They had to hedge their bets, and it was a sort of method of survival that I believe was developed long, long ago. Now, I'm not only talking about social perception, however. I'm also talking about the metaphysical senses. This is a part of our people's history. It's most pronounced within the northern Germanic tribes in Scandinavia, Germania. The position of the Seeress was very important to their culture. And I wish I had taken the time to look into the Celtic tribes to see if there was some sort of corresponding position and what women's role was within the Celtic tribes. I wish I'd taken that time. But the Seeress practiced Seder, which was a sort of feminine magic, a method of divination, and they would often enter trances, whether through music. It's debatable whether you could say psychoactive substances may or may not have been used, but they would enter a sort of trance in order to help them perceive the future. This was, like I said, a very important position, and this goes all the way back to the Nordic Bronze Age. It goes all the way back to then. They have discovered grave sites that were women, and they had different possessions in their grave sites than, say, your typical warrior. There's a walking path just a few feet away. But anyways, women, this is what I would call the divine feminine. This sort of perception that they have. And it's really fascinating to me. You know, this video's kind of a remake of a video I made 3 or 4 years ago, but I think it bears worth repeating, and I wanted to add a few things to it as well. I am very lucky in my life to have always been surrounded by what I would consider very high-minded and good women. My mother was an outstanding mother. My grandparents, my great aunt especially, my mother's aunt, she helped us a lot growing up with many things. She never had children of her own, but she helped us a ton. And even today, my wife we have an outstanding relationship, I guess you could say. I had a friend visit last summer, and he stayed with us for a week. And he was actually shocked at how well we got along. Me and my wife, we've been together for many years. Many, many years. And although we get along fabulously now. It wasn't always the case. All of this, though, of course, was my fault when I was a younger man. I was into drugs, criminality. I have never been able to hide things from my wife. And sadly, oftentimes, I have gotten the feeling that she knows me, perhaps better than I know myself. Back then, let's see, I started getting into drugs when I was 20 years old. And for 11 years, on and off, I struggled with, opiates, Oxycontin, and then the last 3 years was methamphetamine. Now, me and my wife started dating when I was in my early 20s, and the first time that she ever seen me high on opiates, I went to pick her up. We was going to go on a date. She punched me in the eye, gave me a black eye, because she could tell that I was high. Deserved. But she had never been around such things, but opiates, they will constrict your pupils. And she said that when I was high on that shit, that my eyes were extraordinarily blue because your pupils are constricted to pinpoints, so your iris is much larger. She could always tell. I could never hide it from her. And, of course, when I got into methamphetamine, you really can't hide that at all. You can't hide it. But we made it through those years. She stayed with me. I don't know how she stayed with me. I guess she's seen some sort of redeeming quality considering all the things that I was in, and she always hated these things. She absolutely hated them. Back when I was 20, when I first got into that life, I at least had the foresight and the common sense to see quite early on that I did not want my significant other to participate in the things that I was involved in. I didn't want a woman who did drugs. Didn't want it at all. I learned fairly quickly. I seen drug dealers and their girlfriends or their wives. I just seen what a absolute mess it was with both of them doing the same shit. I at least had the foresight to know that I never wanted a woman that did those things. You see, drugs are much harder on women. Honestly. It affects them, which I'm not saying drugs are terrible for everybody, of course, obviously. But it affects women much quicker, and it ruins them much quicker. It's just the reality of things. And having that foresight all those years ago, all those years before I met her and we got together, it saved my life. Really and truly. It saved my life. Because if I was on that same trajectory that I was 6, 7, 8 years ago, I'd either be in prison or dead. One of the two. So that saved my life. And women are able to see things. They notice things. And it's not just, with my wife, going into the metaphysical aspect of things. She has foreseen things before. I remember it was 7 years ago, she told me about a very vivid dream that she had. That me and her had a daughter with blue eyes. My wife is green-eyed, I'm blue-eyed. But I remember she told me about this dream, and I was really interested in it. I really wanted children back then, although I was living a life that was not conducive at all to having children. Being into robbery, criminality, in and out of jail. I probably wouldn't have been a good father back then. But anyways, she had that dream. And although back then I was like, that's a great dream and everything, but I would tell myself, I'm like, that's not happening. Took 7 years, but it happened. Now, I want to tell you a couple of stories. And these involve my mother. And my mother really has displayed a sense of clairvoyance several times in her life. The first one, and my dad had told me this story years and years ago. It happened in 1985. My mother would have been 16 years old. And her and my dad, my father, they were dating back then. They were courting, as we call it here in Appalachia. And it was a Friday night. And my dad picked my mother up, and they rode down to Elizabethton, Tennessee, which is the county seat off the mountain where I was raised. They were going to go to Pizza Hut, get them some pizza, and go watch a movie. They had arrived at Pizza Hut. Now, Elizabethton is probably about a 30-minute drive from the mountain I was raised on. They arrived, and they placed their order. And my mom and dad were sitting there in the booth. This was a couple of years before I was conceived and born. And my mother got this strange look on her face, my dad said. And he asked her, what's bothering her, what's wrong? And she is like, you have to take me home. I've got to get back home. Something has happened to my mother. And my dad's like, wait, what? What are you talking about? And she was like, you need to cancel our order. I've got to get back home. There's something wrong with my mom. Now, this is back in 1985. This is well before cell phones were even a thing. My dad was just like, what the hell, But he cared for my mother. He got the waiter and told him to cancel their order, that they were having to go back home. And my mother was extremely upset the entire 30-minute drive back up the mountain. And lo and behold, as they were pulling into town, getting into town, up on the mountain, they come up on a line of slow traffic, stopped traffic. It's a 2-lane highway right there. It's a really small community. No stoplights. Very rural. And they're having to wait. Traffic is being let by slow, and they see police lights, police cars, and they see an ambulance. And they get up closer, and my mother sees that it is my grandmother. Her mom had been in a bad car crash, and the ambulance was there to get her. Now, she lived through it. She got banged up really bad. She got hit by a truck. Totaled her car, of course. But my dad said this was one of the strangest things that he had ever seen. He had never seen anything like that. Didn't really believe in things like that, per se. But he said it was one of the oddest things that he had ever seen. So, a same sort of event happened about 5 years later. Well, no, about 6 or 7. This would have been in 1991 or 1992. I was alive then. I was 4 or 5 years old when this happened. My mother was pregnant with my younger brother. There's 5 years between us. And once again, ever so often, like on the weekends, we'd go to Elizabethton to do our shopping. And in downtown Elizabethton, there used to be an ice cream shop. That's the old part of town. I believe it's called Elk Avenue. It's a beautiful, beautiful little street with all these little shops. And there was an ice cream shop that was called Heidi Ides Ice Cream Shop. And we would go walk around downtown, and Dad would take us in there, and I'd get me an ice cream cone. The man who worked behind the counter was probably in his early or mid-30s. He was a swarthy looking man. Had a mane of black hair, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, very round-headed. And he wore the glasses, like those thick, I don't know if Jeffrey Dahmer wore those type of glasses or what. Some type of bifocal. I don't know what that style is called. But he was the one that was always working there, and we would go sit at a booth, and he would go back. It was a quiet little ice cream shop, not a lot of business there. But my mother, I remember her distinctly telling my dad that there was something off about that man. She called him the Heidi man. She always told my father, she's like, there is something that is not good about that man. Well, once again, lo and behold, about 3 months later, she was reading the local newspaper, and in it, there was an article, and it had a picture of that man, and he had been arrested and accused of some very indecent things with young girls. It alleged that he had been using that ice cream shop in order to film teenage girls, photograph them in the back of the shop. See, these are these old buildings. And I don't know whatever came from it. I imagine he probably got arrested. Or, well, he did get arrested. I would imagine he did quite a bit of time for that. Probably ended up as a sex offender. But my mother could sense that about him. So see, it's like women most certainly are able to perceive things. Men are able to do this, of course, as well. But our sense, like I just call it intuition. And my intuition has served me well in my life. But you could also say that I also made observations that backed up my initial feeling that came from the pit of my stomach. But I have never in my life had anything happen such as what these two instances regarding my mother. I've never had that happen. And going back to my wife, just a few weeks ago, we had a neighbor that passed away. And 2 days before that, she told me that she had had a dream that he had passed away. 2 days later, it happened. And, you know, I mentioned the Seeress earlier. It's not all that different here in Appalachia. In Appalachia folklore, and they even call it granny magic. The mamaw, the grandmother, is an important part of Appalachian culture, always has been. And they call this sort of folk tradition granny magic. And it's a lot of old traditions. And women, once again, were the practitioners of this. There's a lot of Appalachian traditions. I made this video called Tickets, where I just basically went over what this sort of ritual was. This is a part of that folklore. And I believe this folklore, there's Pennsylvania Brokery, I think is what it's called. There's a book I have called The Red Church that talks about this. It's a very thick book. It talks about the German traditions and their influence on Appalachian folklore. It's an interesting book. I need to finish it here soon. But a lot of the traditions, I believe, while this may have been formulated while our people were Christianized, they'd been Christianized for centuries, there's a lot of these rituals and customs that stretch back to pre-Christian Europe. Using oak trees to write tickets, using various fruit trees, apple trees to do healing rituals. These traditions have been passed down, and they've also incorporated elements of Christianity as well. But it's fascinating to me how women seem to have this sense. I mentioned earlier that I was a very lucky man to have my wife, to have my mother, to have my daughter, and all the women in my family. If you're a single man, you really need to find yourself a woman, and if you don't have a good woman, well, you need to kick the one you have to the curb and find yourself a good one. Because believe you me, women can either make your life a lot harder, a lot more difficult, or they can make it like you're living on easy mode, and I'm in that latter group. I could not imagine life without my wife and all the things that we've been through. Like I said, I'm just very lucky. But anyways, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. Something that had been on my mind the last couple of weeks or so. But anyways, thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.